French Prime Minister Francois Bayrou has lost a vote of confidence in Parliament. The result brings his 9 months in office to an end, plunging France into fresh political turmoil. Legislators voted 364 to 194 to remove him. Most had opposed his plans for deep public spending cuts to rein in debt. He's expected to resign early tomorrow. President Emmanuel Macron will need to find a successor to become France's fifth Prime Minister in the last 2 years. Let's look at this with Jacob Ross. He's a research fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations with a focus on France. He joins us from southern Germany. Welcome to DW. Is this a crisis or is this just how modern French politics works now?
No, this is certainly a new episode of a political crisis that has been haunting France at least since 2022, when Emmanuel Macron, after winning a second mandate and the presidential election, lost the legislative election and lost his majority in parliament. He then last year went on to dissolve the National Assembly, lost further mandates with his party in parliament. And Bayrou's ousting today, the loss of this vote of confidence, is another episode of this longer-lasting political crisis in France.
So what happens now that Prime Minister number 4 has gone?
Well, apparently Emmanuel Macron will do everything he can to find a new prime minister rather quickly. The Élysée communicated this evening that in the next couple of days, talks will be held with potential candidates. There had been speculations these past days already on these potential candidates, spanning from the center-left Socialist Party, Parti Socialiste, to the platform that supports Bayrou's government or supported his government and is close to Macron. Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu has been named as one of the potential candidates to be nominated by President Macron. And if the president will not be successful in these next days to find a successor for ousted Prime Minister Bayrou, he might go on to dissolve the National Assembly again in hope to have clearer majority outcomes in the National Assembly.
OK, but we presume that to be the nuclear option, do we? Or do you think that that's really likely?
Well, I mean, many people have been speculating about this nuclear option just because Macron pulled this last year already. He could do it again. The constitution gives him that right, clearly. And it is really unclear tonight what a new prime minister could really do, since the majority situation will not have changed in the National Assembly. The new prime minister won't have a majority, a stable majority, to vote a budget for next year. He will have to introduce measures to cut the budget in face of the French debt. And so this nuclear option could be a viable option very soon again for the president.
Who stands to benefit from this chaos?
Well, that's a good question that many in France and especially the voters are asking themselves increasingly. Political parties on the extremes, both on the left extreme and the right extreme of the National Assembly and the political spectrum in France, are likely to profit most from this, again, newest episode of this political crisis. The far left La France Insoumise, or representatives of this party, have already called for President Macron himself to resign, since they see him at the center of this crisis, being responsible for it, really. And the far right is apparently already preparing for new elections, no matter if they come in the next days or before the end of the year, when another newly designated prime minister might fall again in the National Assembly.
OK, thanks for talking us through that, Jacob. Jacob Ross from the German Council on Foreign Relations.
Thank you.
Let's get more on this from journalist Cole Stangler in Marseille. Welcome back to DW, Cole. Given the terrible state of French finances, why did Francois Bayrou's plans to overhaul the budget meet with so much opposition?
Well, I think, for one, before we get into it, there is some debate over just how urgent that problem is. France does have a high debt to GDP ratio. It does have budget deficits, but there's debate over just how urgent it is to rein those in through a massive austerity plan, which is essentially what Bayrou was proposing. So there's some debate over how urgent these kind of spending cuts are. I think that's the first point that's important to stress. People say, look, the French, interest rates on French debt is still lower than the U.S., still lower than the U.K. So that's the first part. But it really comes down to what those measures look like, right? In a kind of abstract sense, you can talk about reining in public spending, but what Bayrou was proposing, over 40 billion euros, in budget cuts. These were cuts basically to hospitals. It was a full-year freeze on welfare and pension benefits, freeze in state spending, and then perhaps most controversially, actually removing 2 public holidays. So all this made it sort of a political non-starter for much of the French political spectrum. We saw that reflected in the vote today. You have both the far right, which has a real chunk of working class voters supporting it, and of course also the left, which is opposed to this sort of kind of austerity on principle. So it was really a political non-starter.
Mr Bayrou's successor will become France's 5th Prime Minister in 2 years. Unions are calling for a national general strike, and there's this Block Everything movement with as many, it's reported, as 100,000 people thought to be getting ready to come out on the streets. Has France become ungovernable?
Well, I think we're in the midst of a very serious political crisis. I think that's a tougher question, but we have a real political crisis here that there's not an easy way out. Okay, so right now Emmanuel Macron could, in theory, name another prime minister. We've already seen now, as you mentioned, a couple of attempts to sort of have right-wing prime ministers that are close to his party, that are essentially relying on the National Rally as kingmaker in the National Assembly. So do we have another, now third try at the same strategy of having a right-wing prime minister? Macron has said he'll name one in the coming days. Or do we maybe go to the left? That's another possibility. But then, to your question, if it seems like none of these proposals are workable, if you can't have a prime minister that can amass even a relative majority in today's hyper-divided French National Assembly, well, then you start to have this question of, do you need to go to new elections? And then that's something that's becoming more and more on people's minds. And frankly, people are talking more and more openly about, do we have to have new elections like the one that Macron called for last year? And I think also to understand some of the kind of frustration, the anger at the president right now, there's a sense that Macron himself is the architect of this crisis. Remember, we have to go back to his decision to call for these snap elections in the first place last year, those snap elections that resulted in this extremely divided National Assembly. He didn't have to do that. And so you have extremely divided National Assembly, and a sense among voters that their will wasn't really being respected at the polls with these prime ministers. So we have a deep political crisis. I don't know if France is ungovernable yet, but we're sort of ticking down the box, ticking down the list of different options here. If there's no prime minister available, dissolution, snap elections, that becomes a real possibility. And then the final card, which is definitely not on the table right now in a serious way, is should Macron have to resign? And that's what you have some kind of calls on the far left for that to happen. Polls show a lot of French people want him to resign. That's off the table for now. But the more France is in this political crisis, the more people are starting to think about these sort of out-of-box, unprecedented, seemingly unimaginable solutions.
And you do see this as a crisis. This is not just the way French politics is conducted in the modern age.
No, absolutely not. One of we're in what a lot of people in France are calling a regime crisis of the French Fifth Republic, which has this very strong executive. France is not accustomed to parliamentary politics like Germany, like Italy. France has this very strong president, and Macron has this authority to dissolve the assembly, to use executive decrees. He has this broad authority, but the problem is right now there's a sense that he's extremely isolated, and that maybe the system ultimately isn't built for a country that, I think that's the real question here, a system that concentrates so much power in the hands of an individual, the president, is not built for a country where you have three broadly divided political camps that are not accustomed to compromise like you have in Germany, where parties are accustomed to working with one another. Today in the French National Assembly, the far right, the left bloc, and the Macronist bloc are not very interested in working together. And so how do you fix that with a very strong president? So these are the kind of regime questions that are becoming on the table here.
Let's quickly zoom out then to look at what's going on in French society. Tell us more about this Block Everything movement, which is hoping to bring the country to a standstill in a couple of days.
So maybe people recall the Yellow Vests movement, which was this kind of spontaneous movement that began over a proposed hike in the fuel tax in late 2018. So what's interesting about this movement, the Block Everything movement that's slated to take place on Wednesday, the 10th, is that it has some of those similar, has a similar feel in a lot of respects to the Yellow Vest movement. It started online, so outside the sort of institutional actors in France, outside political parties, outside labor unions. And what's happened now is you've had a number of parties on the left say they're supporting these strikes, these protests. Part of it is strikes. Part of it may be simple protests outside of city halls. Some of it might be more radical actions, like trying to block the streets, disruptive. And you have some unions that are supporting it as well. So September 10th is going to be a big test as well. How many people actually show up? It's hard to know because, again, this is happening outside the sort of institutional framework. When French unions call for mass strikes, you tend to have a kind of sense, even a couple of days before, how they're going to go. This is a lot of grassroots, online, kind of vague. So a lot of people are going to be looking closely at what happens. People don't quite know. We have another date for mass protests, September 18th. That one unions have called for, perhaps could be even bigger. The reports are suggesting that the government is even more concerned about those September 18th protests. So you have a lot of pent-up frustration. Again, it goes back to that question I was talking about, which is the democracy in France. How is it that a lot of people feel like you have a government that's imposing these austerity measures, imposing its will on a public that didn't want it, that didn't ask for it? And so that's part of this as well. It's a broader kind of democratic frustration that's connected to those kind of social economic issues that were part of the Yellow Vest. But it's a kind of deep-seated frustration, and it's why a lot of people don't know how big this could be.
Good talking to you, Cole. Thanks for talking us through that. That's journalist Cole Stangler in Marseille.
Thank you.